So welcome to another Thursday with Third Path Live podcast. On every episode, you'll meet thought leaders, role models, and change agents connected to the Third Path community. We've got an exciting season planned where we will be exploring why the new ideal employee is someone just like you, someone who wants to integrate work and life. And if you are inspired by what we hear today, please share our podcast with someone you know and join us again next month. Very shortly, I'll be introducing our guests for today's event. But before I do so, let me provide a big picture of what we'll be talking about. So for those of you who have been part of the Third Path webinar before, our live town halls, you've probably seen this picture before. It's a reminder that we all have a certain amount of energy. And for some of us, there's more or less, but all of us have a certain amount. And that if we're somebody who is doing work and family responsibilities, we're hoping that you've been learning through our Thursday live podcast that you'll also create some time for recharge time. But the bottom line is we have a certain amount of energy, and the smarter we are around setting some boundaries around how much time we give to work and family, we will also hopefully then have time to recharge, which makes it all possible. And one of the interesting things that contributes to this is what's happening at home. And that's our big conversation today. We have Eve Rodsky, who will be sharing some of the information she's learned in her book, Fair Play, and these wonderful cards that you can sign up for and be part of the raffle for today's raffle with the Eve's cards. And in those cards, she's really done a great job of identifying all the different things that happen at home. Some of it is just stuff to do with getting your home organized. Some is outside your home, but still an important part of making our lives at home work. Some is caregiving. That might be children, that might be aging parents, that might be pets, maybe all of the above. And then there's a magic suite that she talks about that happen on less of a regular time, but just as important, like holidays. And I love the best of all her wild cards. She's really captured the truth that sometimes we've got a great plan in place, and then along comes elder care, or a glitch in your daily schedule, or a job loss, or a new job, or moving. So all of these things are at play, and it can make it so that we are balancing a lot and sometimes too much. The other factor that can play into our home life is actually less visible sometimes, but it's how money plays into things. And if you wanted to learn more about this, I highly recommend listening to our last month's webinar where we talked about work-family balance and finance. And on it, one of the panelists talked about this concept of the harmful work-family financial cycle. In some cases, everybody's working a lot and therefore hopefully earning more. But what that can also mean is that they're home less and they're doing less at home. And that means that they're outsourcing more and spending more and saving less, and therefore they have to earn more. And it becomes kind of a vicious cycle. And so I put this on the table today because as you're trying to think about how you want to share the mental load, find a fair solution at home, sometimes a hidden ingredient is how we spend our time. And if you listen to that webinar, you'll learn that one of the panelists figured out how to really cut down in this negative cycle. So they had more time at home and, more time to do things at home, less spending, more savings. So back to Eve's cards. I love them. One of the things I love about them is that she points out that some of them are the daily grind cards. That's with the little coffee figure on it. Things that you got to do every day. There's not really a negotiation. You need food, so you got to make it happen. And she's really talked about some really important basic concepts that Third Path's been advocating for a long time. The idea that you need to one person can conceive, plan, and execute all aspects of the card. And so it's the idea that, my husband does a lot of the cooking. And so I don't have to really think about the cooking. In fact, my old joke is he would sometimes ask me, what do you want for dinner? And I would say to him, I don't want to think about what I want for dinner. And that's how it worked in our family. I had other quote unquote cards I was holding and being fully responsible for. Another thing she points out is you don't have to play with a full deck. That is the best concept ever. In our household, we've let go of a lot of cards because there's just too much to do. And so having a beautiful house that looks like a home and garden house is not on my list of things. My mom might be disappointed by that, but hey, she ain't living my life. And then you also need to find a standard of care or a standard of whatever the responsibility is. I joke that my husband was very patient with my low standard of cleaning care. And that just was the truth. When our kids were little, that's just what we had to do. Luckily, they're adults now, and I have a little bit more time on my hand, and I don't mind having a fairly clean house, but it doesn't have to be spotless. And so my standard's a little bit better today than it used to be. And most importantly, and this is something B. Hibbs will talk a lot about too, the goal isn't necessarily 50-50. The goal is fair. Do you both feel like the solution is working for you? Which is why I want to put up another slide here, again, to get our conversation oriented in the right direction. There's going to be a free resource on our website next week when this webinar becomes available. And in it, you'll see that there's a quiz from B. Hibbs. We call it our fairness quiz. I'm showing you the first part of it right now. And it's the idea that sometimes we don't actually engage in the conversation that needs to happen to find that fair answer. And sometimes it's because of our own discomfort with dealing with a difficult conversation. And, you know, my thought about relationships is you got to have some difficult conversations. That's part of a healthy relationship. And that it's really learning how to speak up. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. And what to do where you don't give up. Instead, you try to find a good answer that's a fair answer for both of you. I'll talk more about that picture on the right in a little bit. It's the idea that when you have two people, whether they're two people at home or two people at work, there's a relationship that's happening between those two people. And to find fair answers, you need to almost imagine that relationship as a third thing, a relational space, and create a healthy relational space. And part of a healthy relational space is learning how to speak up and look for answers that feel fair. So as you can see, we got a lot on the table that we're going to be figuring out. And we've got some great free resources on our website, including actually a guide that you can use to kind of think about how to set up your work family solution. It's for free to download from our website. And I wanted to give a little inspiration, a story from Eve's book, something that I really loved when I came across it. A father talking about how he had made a change in his life and became more involved and engaged at home. And then the amazing part of the story about when his daughter was old enough to get married, how she toasted her dad for the kind of relationship and role modeling he had done. I bet she looked for a different kind of husband because of the kind of engagement that her father had played in her life, or partner, I should say. So there's a lot on the table around how to think differently here, but I hope this last quote reminds you that there's a lot of opportunity of really creating a healthy, strong relationship with your partner. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to have Eve Rodsky join us. Again, don't forget, you can put your name and address in our chat box and sign up for those wonderful cards that go along with her book, Fair Play. And B. Hibbs, someone who's been part of the Third Path community for a very, very long time. When I read her book, Try to See It My Way, many, many, many years ago, it was foundational in my ability to think about what are we trying to teach the world and helping couples find fair solutions as they struggle to balance work and caring for children and all the other things that they do. So welcome. Welcome. I'm so glad the two of you are here. It's really great to have you both. This is such an important concept and topic, and clearly, even though Third Path's been working on this for 23 years, something still people are struggling with. So Eve, you've been out there talking about this for a long time. Thank you for the work you've done. What would you like to add to our discussion so far that maybe really hit you as a very important thing to underscore?
Well, I love, Jessica, that you're first of all, you're like an expert at PowerPoint. I love always how you distill everything. You're a great distiller. And one thing that was interesting for me to really underscore is that there is a secret formula. And actually you brought up all three pieces of that relational space, or I look at it as relational health, which I think, is a big piece of mental and physical health. And the three secret formula pieces to really getting this right, again, right meaning can stay in practice, fair, as B and I like to say, fair, is boundaries, systems, and communication. And so as somebody who's came to this work as a lawyer, and I have my sister profession over on the right and left of me, which are, clinical psychologists, LCSWs, LMFTs. But the way I look at the world is I look at it from a legal perspective of behavior design. So when I approached this work, it wasn't that I wanted to change hearts and minds, or even that I really cared what people thought. I just wanted to start seeing behavior change. And that's sort of the work I do for a living, which is I work for families that look like the HBO show Succession. And so, yes, you all feel bad for me, but I've been working in family systems for so long through rules, through governance, through rules for how people engage with each other. And often I found that gamifying difficult conversations was really important. So I'll give you that context because, again, I think B and I come at this from a mirror image, because I'm not looking to change hearts and minds. I'm looking to change behaviors. And part of that, we have to, as you said, have difficult conversations. But for me, the easiest part to start was not boundaries or systems. Or boundaries or communication, because that's actually really very triggering. It was systems. And I figured if I could convince people at least this one thing, that their home is full of decision fatigue, that their home is not efficient, that their home, as one man said to me, which I thought was so funny, is a place where they every single day, and these are both people who are, one woman is an organizational psychologist, actually, in HR, but her husband said to me that their home is one where they wait to decide who's taking the dog out right when it's about to take a piss on the rug every day. And so even my Aunt Marion's Mahjong group, Jessica, has more clearly defined expectations in the home. If you don't bring snack twice to that group, you're out. But the home is a complete and total decision fatigue nightmare, where the two top words that women reported to me over 12 years of research, and now in 17 countries, is that they feel overwhelmed and erasure of their identity. So that's just a terrible way to live. And men married to those women, if we're centering the hetero cisgender relationship where a lot of these norms and assumptions come about, men said to me that their number one gripe or grievance with home life is that they can't get anything right. And so if you look at this, it's just not, the way we're doing things now doesn't serve anybody. And so the only way that I could start, because again, boundaries is very triggering and communication is very triggering, which we'll talk about in this context of division of labor, but systems I could get people around. And so then when I started to tell people, okay, you could do an ownership mindset. It can be fair. It doesn't have to be 50-50. You don't have to take out the dog once. I have to take out the dog once. How about we do it through the way we do it at work, where you have a responsibility. You can always redeal that responsibility, but you do it with executive function, which means conception, planning, and execution. It's not just that you go to the store for the mustard. You understand the context that you're going because your second son, Johnny, likes yellow mustard with his protein. Otherwise he chokes. And you're also monitoring the mustard for when it runs low and getting stakeholder buy-in from the family for what they need. If you have that context, then you show up at the grocery store and you actually buy the yellow mustard, not spicy Dijon, which men often are coming home with every freaking time. And then women were telling me, well, how can I trust my partner with your card estate planning, my living will? Because my partner can't even bring home the right type of mustard. Once you hear that cycle, you realize what people are not talking about. They're not talking about mustard. They're talking about something deeper. The presenting problem becomes not the real problem. They're talking about an erasure of accountability and trust in their most important organization, which is the home. And so that's why I actually did not release the Fair Play cards with the book, because I was too afraid, without laying the groundwork of fair play, which no one really was talking about in 2016 when I went out with the book. I really wanted to lay the groundwork that this is not a scorekeeping exercise of who holds more cards. It's not a martyrdom of I hold all the cards. What it is, it's a tool, a conversational tool. So I think that's the context. And the last thing I will say about gamification of difficult conversations was, this started because all my patriarchs that look like the Logan Roys of the world, these very difficult patriarchs, when I would go in and hired by their family offices to start talking about their governance, their succession, their family systems, I was told by the patriarchs that I didn't need to be there because they were not going to die. And so what do? As you said, do you speak up or you just give up? So I decided not to give up. And I realized if I can put cards in front of these patriarchs, let's look at this card game. Where do you see your legacy? Oh my gosh, you picked the newspaper. Why? Oh, you had a newspaper route. You want to teach people to fish, not give handouts. Okay, great. That's your legacy. I started to get people talking about their stories in a way that brought humanity to these conversations, in the same way that we often are talking in fair play about housework and chores. When you really look at those cards that you brought up on your beautiful PowerPoint, holidays, groceries, that's where all of our foundational memories are actually made, in the context of our meals, in the context of what we do for our holidays, even in the context of, did you remember if anybody brought you flowers to your recital as a kid, if you had one? So that's this context of why I thought systems was a great place to tackle, because I wasn't seeing people doing it through sort of the legal governance lens of behavior design. And that's sort of where I decided to start.
Wow. And, just to put another, underscore how helpful it's been, I've been talking to some young people early in their marriages, before kids, who've tried out your cards, and it's helped them at that stage. And if you think about it, I mean, again, those patterns that we build early on in our relationships will help us as we transition, if we decide to become parents, transition to parenthood. The idea that we can have a discussion, that we can gamify and have a good, helpful, healthy discussion about these important things. I want to say one last thing, and I want to hear what Bea wants to add to this conversation. I love that you were talking about the importance of holidays and meals and all that stuff, because really that's at the heart of what Third Path was founded on. I love my job. I always want to work, but I think family and community is something that is even more important to the health of our society. And so what you're really trying to do in your book and your games, and what Bea is doing in her work, is we're reimagining what we can do to create healthy families, healthy communities, because really that is the goal here. And if we come to our families too exhausted, and without the ability to kind of think whatever way we want, in new ways, it's not a happy place that we're looking at. But the opportunity of thinking differently is really exciting. That's why you guys are all here today, because we get a chance to think differently about all this stuff. Bea, you've been doing this work with couples for a very long time, wrote an exceptionally good book about these ideas. What would you like to add to the conversation that hasn't been said, or you want to underscore?
Well, I want to really acknowledge Eve's creative venture into what psychologists would call behavioral activation, which is like, how do you get behavior change? And from, my clinical experience as a family psychologist, I mean, I think any kind of, I'm going to call it like tool that you can use to help people concretize, like, how do I do this? How can I, have a constructive conversation about issues related to what couples often argue about, which is money, chores, children and sex, is helpful. I would say that we come at these from kind of two different ways. And I think, Eve, you're referring to this at kind of the end of your kind of overview here, which is that, so we can start from either the outside in or the inside out. And usually you have to incorporate both, because the meaning that people attach, first of all, everyone you'll ever encounter thinks they know what's fair. It's an intergenerational transmission. It's unconscious. But it's also hardwired, because neuroscientists will tell you that there's what they call a fairness organ in the brain, and it's mammalian. Every mammal has it. You can see it in, like, chimpanzees, how they respond to someone who doesn't food share. They beat them up. So, and they have more controlled experiments than that, but basically it's what you see in marriages sometimes, or partnerships. It's like not that different than chimpanzees. So it registers really strongly when we don't feel fairly treated, and when we feel disrespected because I'm doing more, or when the other person actually just doesn't even understand the meaning of why something is important to us. So part of the task of kind of discerning what's fair is reevaluating I'm going to call it the model we hold for what fair is. Because in a relationship, everybody brings their own unconscious model, its framework for how we did it, how it happened, who does what, like who's responsible for what we didn't like in terms of that model from our own families. And then when we meet another person, they bring theirs too. However, they never just, say, hello, here's my model for what's fair. It only comes out in disagreements and arguments and like kind of intractable, what Eve is referring to, like, let's just wait and see if the dog pees on the rug, and then let's figure out who to blame, because whose turn was it to take the dog out? So part of what you see is almost like a brinkmanship, like almost gambling for like who's gonna, have the dog pee on the rug, rather than have people recognize what is their vested interest and how to settle this, and how to reevaluate that their family model wasn't necessarily right. It was just their family model, and that they have to make a conscious decision, a thoughtful decision, an evaluation even of whether it's going to work in their own lives. Because many people are very loyal to their family of origin model, and they feel also not particularly free to break out of it. And they judge the other. And I can't tell you how many couples, I mean, it's such a trope, is like people get married and they decide whose family is better. And therefore we should do what the better family thinks is the way to raise children, or do this or do that. And it's such a harmful way of like shaming one person about the not better family, and also idealizing, any particular model isn't a thoughtful way to conduct one's own life.
Yeah.
So part of my work is in helping people understand that underlying the behavioral changes, and I'm sure Eve gets to this, it's just a different approach, is understanding what informs the meaning behind what's fair, what traditions they're attached to, what assumptions they're making about what the other person should or should not do and be responsible for. And so that's a way of conceptualizing it. Part of what therapists do that's different than what Eve's doing is they don't tell, there's a lot of resistance to change. So they don't tell people kind kind of out loud, like, you have an intergenerational model of fairness. You don't know what we're going to work around that until, like, you can figure this out. But there are many guidelines that are helpful to people, and I'm all for like having like any kind of tool. And Eve's obviously worked really hard on, kind of concretizing these issues in ways that help people have access to them, where they can name them, like, and name kind of their attachment really to these different roles and that sort of thing. I would say one more thing. These are wildcard issues, which Eve, you may have, I'm not sure. My next two books after Try to See It My Way were on parenting adolescents and young adults into their 20s. And there is no bigger deal breaker in relationships than the polarization that happens around child rearing and what's in the best interest of a child. I don't know if you've gamified that yet. If you have, please let me know. I'd be really interested.
Yeah, it's the whole, it's the concept of failure to launch.
Yes.
And how, for 1,000 reasons, we are dealing with a real pressing issue of young adults really struggling
Very
with
much
mental health issues. And
Yep.
that could be a whole nother topic. Well, we will stick with just kind of younger families
That's fine.
today, but that is a really important one. We could spend a lot. So B, I want to underscore what I heard you talk about, and I'll just try to make it concrete in my life just to help people see it. Because of who I am and how I was raised, it was really important to be organized and plan. And it probably goes back generations in my family, why we are that way.
Yeah.
My husband, on the other hand, is a go with the flow guy. And again, if you go back in his family generations, there's a lot of logic with why they did go with the flow.
Right.
And along comes this marriage, planner, go with the flow. And we both thought we had the right answer.
Yeah.
So there were some big arguments. Back to your point, I think people need to be okay with having an argument and figure out how to learn to get through arguments. And here we are 30 plus years later. And honestly, if Jeffrey was here with us, he would say the same thing I'm about to say. Hey, turns out go with the flow and planning are both really valuable.
Yes.
And you probably even found somebody who's different than you for that, because of who you are. So it's just this very interesting truth about who we end up with probably brings something different to the relationship that can either cause a lot of stress, or eventually, because you learn how to see things together, join together and think creatively together, come up with good solutions. It just makes a better answer. There's more, all of us could say. Eve's been listening in. You might be dying to say something, and then I'll come back to B if she wants. You don't have to say something, but I just want to give you another chance.
Well, I think B said something really important, a lot of important things, but I really, again, as somebody who looks at this, again, from the outside in, right? You don't want people to vote in Georgia. You pass a law not to have them vote in Georgia. You want people to stop at a stop sign, right? You pass a law to have them stop at a stop sign. So I'm really looking at behavior design from that perspective. I think what B said that's really important is that we now know, at least from like sort of the legal governance, anti-bias work side of things, that one of the best ways to end bias is to move from assumptions, as B was talking about, to structured decision-making. And so that's why, again, I think you do need to inside out and outside in. You can't do one without the other. In fact, we work with many therapists now. We've trained 300 therapists in sort of the Fair Play system or this tool, and then we've learned from them. And one of the interesting ways that I've learned from clinical psychologists, especially, is a new way to use the cards, which I thought was really interesting. So one of the first clinical psychologists to use the cards in a beta testing mode said that she started to use them not just as a way to explore ownership and to really, as you said, concretize what has to be done, but she started to use the cards. And Jessica, I could do it with you really quickly, but what she started to do was she used it as a game where she would just start to shuffle like a magic trick and then stop. And then let's play. Let's do this for 30 seconds. See what I mean? Okay, I'm just going to shuffle And then you'll just tell me when to stop.
Stop.
And okay, let's see what we picked. Okay, wait, let's do it one more time.
Stop.
Okay, here we go. All right. So this is the one that you picked. Weekend plans. So what she would do with it is she would have a couple just say, okay, tell me your stories of what you remember growing up. So Jessica, give me an example of what is like one of your fondest memories of weekend plans, or who planned your weekends, or do you remember what you did on the weekends growing up?
This is fascinating because instantly I can think about what it was like growing up, but also I can think about the present, and then also I can think about when we had young kids, and I can see where we're going. I'm not avoiding the question. I want to make sure we get to the next part of our thing,
Yes,
but I see it like you can just take one card and get people a couple to kind of think about their personal stories, their historical stories, their where they want to go stories. That's a great
I'll give
tool.
you an example that she did. She told me about. She told me about this couple was having like an intractable fight over meal planning, back to go with the flow. So it kept being like, it always seems like men are more go with the flow. I'll just say that that's a gendered thing that happens because there's weaponized incompetence in that of not having to plan. But anyway, so this couple was having that fight, and it was a hetero cisgender couple. The mom really wanted from scratch meals, like she wanted her partner to cook when it was his turn to provide meals, and he was doing, McDonald's and Domino's, and they couldn't solve this. And so this clinical psychologist said to me that she started to ask that question with the cards about, give me your stories of like what you remember about grocery shopping growing up. So it turns out that the woman, we'll call her Mary, she went to the Fulton Fish Market with her dad every weekend. They would pick out fish. He would explain to her the difference between fillets and whole fish. It was a really, really foundational memory for her. And she learned to meal prep from him. And he had actually recently died before they were married. So it was actually really triggering to her that her partner had never met her father. So it became all these things that were so much deeper. And when she was able to explain her why about what mattered to her, her partner was obviously much more willing to be open and understanding, to not say, well, you care more, so you should do it. But I care because you care. That's a very different way to sort of have these conversations.
Fabulous. And there's so much more we want to say just about that, but I love that use of the cards. That's fabulous. Really, really wonderful.
So
yeah. We luckily have one more amazing smart mind to join to the conversation today. So hold on one second. So in addition to the wonderful guests you've already been hearing from, we're also going to have Yael Schonbrun join us. And I'm really excited about her as well, because she has also written another great book and also done a lot of great work with couples. So it feels like we've got like this powerhouse of people thinking about these issues. And again, I wanted to use this concept of relational space as the next place we go to, because I found it really helpful to think about what Eve just shared with us. Is they learned a little bit about this third thing that is part of a couple. There's the two people, and then there is the space between them. And the space between them, if they treat it as its own thing, what they learned in that story was, hey, I learned a little about your history, and now I better understand why we are doing what we're doing and what's important to you is. And so I'm going to be curious about what's important to you, and I'm going to, listen. And there's just such an opportunity of treating a space between the couple as a place to be learn about what is required to get done well, do our family well. Why is a fair or equitable solution going to be really beneficial to everybody? And so that's where I want us to go next, is talk a little bit more about this relational space. And again, when you approach this relational space in this way, you're doing a lot of the tips that is suggested in this handout that we'll have available on our website. You give up that you're right. You learn a little bit about your own blind spots. You stop saying shoulds as the answer. You have a better balance between give and take. You show a lot of appreciation. I think that's something that I see in couples that have figured this stuff out, is they're genuinely appreciative of what they're working on together. If you're unfair, you say, whoops, I messed up. And instead of complaining or being silent, you ask for what you want. You're not keeping score. You're looking for something that's fair with actions, and you're showing up that way. So there's a lot of really good tips that Bee's brought that's helping create that healthy relational space. All right, so without further ado, I'm really glad to have Yael join us too. Wonderful. Look, the gang's all here. Pretty amazing. Yael, you've been listening in. You've bring so much wisdom to this conversation as well. What are you dying to share that you've been hearing that you want to underscore, or a new idea that you want to put on the table? Tell us.
Well, so I'm a couples therapist by training, and I hail from the halls of academia too. And my book is actually has a chapter about relationships, but it's mostly about the relationship between roles. And so what's really interesting is that a lot of the wisdom that we understand about from couples therapy, from couples research, can actually be applied to the relationship that exists between roles. And this wasn't something that I had been studying before I became a working parent, but because I'm such a relationally focused person because of my professional life, when I became a working parent, I started thinking about this, like, these roles are really in conflict with one another. But just as Eve and Bee have been describing, some of the ways that conflict happens is actually quite beneficial. And Jessica, you too, your example of go with the flow versus of being more of a planner is such a great example of how there can be tension and conflict, but that if we approach it strategically, we can really take advantage of the pressure that exists between two ways of being. So we can turn conflict into this advantageous complementary relationship. And so a lot of the writing that I do about work and parenthood, and more generally having multiple demanding roles, comes from this model of, if you can think of the picture of the yin and the yang, that the two opposing sides press upon each other, but they're not actually in conflict. They're opposing, but in this quite helpful, integrated, complementary way. And using that kind of a mindset and approach, we can do the same thing with our roles. We can turn this tension, this conflict between our roles that are both vying for our time and our attention and our energy, into something that really benefits us. And what's very cool is that when you dive into the academic research on things like creativity, on rest, on happiness, on stress management, there's a variety of ways that tension between our roles actually gives us opportunity, gives us specific, unique advantages to accessing more of these good things that we want in life. And so again, so much of what you guys are talking about in the realm of relationships really applies to the relationship that we have between our most important life roles. So that was what I was burning to tell everybody.
That's great. And just to give you a concrete example of what Yael is talking about, in other words, I am a parent, I am a worker. And her book does a great job talking about how you can feel like it's a lose-lose situation. And what she helps you do in that book is see that it's a win-win situation. And it gives you many, many examples of that. It's certainly up third pass alley, because we really have been talking for 23 years about how I am a better parent because I also have my work self, and I am a better worker because I also have my parent self. And so she's done an outstanding job of explaining why an integrated approach, which is really what the third path is a really healthy, creative, can be really healthy, creative, and energizing approach. Yael, thank you for reminding us that at the root of all this is a society we're trying to create where it becomes normal that parents are also workers, and workers also have care responsibilities. And so it's really good for us to bring that into the conversation, because that's where we want to go. We want to be a society that has plenty of time for the care work that we need to do alongside being great employees. There might be something else you want to add there, Yael, and then I'll see if Bee wants to add something to the conversation.
Yeah, I'll add one more piece, which is, in some ways it's about acceptance of the fact that we have multiple roles. And the other part that I really emphasize in the book is that in some ways, it's really about accepting that the tension is unavoidable. It's a part of being human. It's a part of having a rich life, and that we're never really going to have enough time for it all, for all the things that feel super important to us. And that's okay. That's sort of baked into being human. And in fact, serves us well, because if we had more time, then we might overinvest in one pocket of life to the detriment of the other. And again, the tension between roles helps us achieve a balance that we otherwise wouldn't be able to achieve. And that can happen between work and parenting, but it can happen between any assortment of roles that you have in life, friendship, being the child of a parent, being a worker, being a hobbyist, being a spiritual community member. These different pockets of life and investment in all of them is really important for a full, rich, happy life. And in fact, research shows that the more roles that we have, the happier we are to a certain extent. Once you really hit too many, it can be quite overwhelming and you can hit burnout. But there is a pretty wide swath where the more investment, the more roles you inhabit, it's actually better for your mental health and your physical health and your social health. But that also means that there is more role tension. And so the question isn't how do we get rid of it and how do we make all the time that available that we want to have. Instead, it's how do we use that tension in strategic, skillful ways.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I want to translate what you're saying to the couple side of things and the mental load, and then see if B wants to add something to those concepts, because I think of it as, again, if we just keep it simple, you and your partner are both working, you and your partner are also both parents. And so just in that simple model, there are 4 roles that are being managed. And what that means is, there's this constant shift. I love this point that it's not like you're going to get rid of the tension. That's always going to be there. There's going to be something happening at work that's unexpected. There's going to be something happening at home is unexpected. And, there's 2 jobs, so it's not just one, that there's the unexpected at work. And so what Yael is reminding us is that there's this kind of very fluid, constantly shifting landscape in a world where both parents are working and caregivers, and that tension is normal. And so part of it is you yourself getting comfortable with that idea that you're not doing something wrong when you're experiencing that. And part of it is couples getting smart around how to manage that with each other. I could provide millions of stories of how Jeff and I got smart around managing the ups and downs of all those roles that we're handling. But B, what have you learned around helping a person managing those multiple roles, or the couple managing all of those roles?
So thank you both, Jessica, for summarizing, and Yael for coming up with that really, thoughtful way of understanding this is bigger than an individual problem, right? And it's also complementary to becoming an individual that has lots of roles that they can benefit from. Part of what I suggest to individuals, but also to couples, is when you're feeling burdened, you can obviously try to think about, is there something that I can do that's in my control to make this better, whether that's letting go of some standard of care, like you're saying, hey, I don't want to clean or cook or whatever it is. But the other is, especially with children who can be, my favorite quote by D.W. Winnicott, who's a child psychiatrist, dead now, but very well known in the 20th century. He said, children are a burden whom we choose to call children. And I thought, thank you, Dr. Winnicott, because I thought, I would remind myself over and over when I was feeling totally on overload with being a parent, with all the wild cards that come up there. This was my choice. I chose this. This was my choice, and I need to show up for it. And just even helping myself, recognize this isn't something that was done to me. Just even with work, we have more options than we think we have. And so part of it is saying, even the things that we feel burdened by in a particular moment, if we can say, what's in my control to make this go better for myself, or as a team, kind of carry the load more evenly, then it becomes in a marriage, the more we can combine those kind of role tensions and say, good team, the better our marriage is. And it's the same really in parent-child relationships. The more we can change those feelings of like, I'm on total overload and into what's gratifying about what I'm doing and what can I show up for in a different way. It becomes the most meaningful thing you can do in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I know a lot of people listening in today are really curious about how we share the mental load in this complex equation. And so I want to make sure we spend a little more time talking about that. And then a reminder that we will be having a town hall part of this discussion that will be off camera, where people can really ask specific questions. We're going to do it in a way where people will be able to work in small groups and think about these issues. Because this, as you can see, is a complex issue. Many ways to get into this discussion, from cards to couples therapy to recognizing that we all just manage many roles. And so, even our own personal journeys and attitudes can make a difference here too. All right, so we want to get back to thinking about the mental load. I want to put something out to both of you guys. You have worked with couples, and you might have a very different answer to this question. I have a theory. Backed up by a lot of work by work-life researchers, that it is more often that work spills into family life than the other way around. Now, that doesn't mean family life doesn't spill into work sometimes, but there's a lot of evidence that work spills into family life, meaning our jobs are very demanding and there's no end to how much work we all could do. So if you think about those roles that we were talking about, that Yael reminded us about, you've got one parent who's a worker, another parent who's a worker, and then we've got the kids that we're trying to think about. We've got this two jobs that are going to keep on taking more of our time, as much of our time as it can. My theory, and I wonder if you guys have seen this, is that part of the culprit is couples just come home exhausted because there's an awful lot on their plates, because work will ask then some and more of them. And so what happens is couples come home just exhausted, and they've got the nights and the weekends to do all of the other stuff that's supposed to happen. And then they're back to Monday. I'm curious, is part of the problem of how we share the mental load just the exhaustion we bring to our home life from jobs that ask too much of us? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Well, Jessica, I think that part of your first slide was like, where do we set boundaries? Because you're right. It's like, whether it's work or people or whatever, people can ask anything. But you have to set the boundaries that work in your own life. And they may be hard to set. It may be part of the work culture, which goes back to what's the ideal employer as well as the employee. And clearly, I think, the recent changes in the labor force are in favor of the flexibility to employees now. And that flexibility can also, and I often encourage couples, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, Yael, to set a time when the world goes away. The work world goes away, everything just goes away. The phone goes away. They'll just turn it off, because it's just bombarding people today.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So I talk about this a lot in my book. There's this concept called psychological detachment, which is effectively exactly what Bea is saying, which it's this process of turning fully off. And what researchers who have explored psychological detachment find is that you actually don't have to step into a non-demanding role to get the benefits of turning off from whatever role you're stepping away from. So they've done this really fascinating study that is sort of this paradigm shifting study that followed Israeli workers, half of whom were Army reservists, and they were all working at the same company. And so those that were called into active duty, as they followed them over time, had less work burnout than those that stayed working. So what does that mean? It means that those that were called into fighting wars had less work burnout. So what do we take away from that? the active ingredient of reducing work burnout was fully turning off from work. And it didn't mean that they weren't turned on to something else, but it did mean that they had a break from work. Mm-hmm. And so what I think can be really valuable if you do inhabit multiple demanding roles is to be very deliberate and have this mindset where when you step away from one, you very deliberately turn off what you're stepping away from and using the fact of turning on what you're stepping into. So if it is work versus parenting, at the end of the workday, to really be dedicated to turning off your work self, right? And it's difficult to do because we are, in some sense, more and more expected to be available, but recognizing that this is actually good for our work to turn off. It helps us to recharge our batteries, to step fully into parenting mode. That still doesn't address your initial question, Jessica, which is that we're often really tired. So how do we turn on to parenting when we're just totally wiped? And there, I think the science of subtraction is really helpful. And this is, again, a science that I dive really deep into, because I think in general in our world, we're really compelled to just add more and more things to our plate. And what's interesting from a scientific perspective is that we're neurologically set up to do that. That's our default position, is that when there is a problem that we are confronted with in life, we tend to come up with additive solutions. And that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, because if you think about pre-modern stressors, it was usually not enough calories, not enough social connections, not enough shelter. And so the default is to add more. Now, that doesn't work so well in our modern life, where the problem isn't not enough, it's too much. And so there, what we need to do is to develop deliberate practices of taking things off our plate, because it's not going to happen naturally. Our brains are simply not wired for it. And so I'm a busy working parent. I have 3 kids. My husband works too. This is a practice that is really challenging for me, but one that I'm absolutely dedicated to. When I get really stressed out, the practice is, what needs to be deleted from the list? What needs to come off? And I think that is really important. And then the other thing that I'll say too is one of the practices that used to be such a common part of our life, spiritual practices, where we have more structure around rest time, not available to us. And so I think that it is really critical for people who feel very tired, who find themselves burning out regularly, to establish regular rest practices that are not simply about moving from one role to another, but really about turning it all off, even if it's very, very brief. You can get a lot out of a couple of minutes of turn-off time if you have an attitude of mindfulness and develop it as a regular practice.
Wow. Wonderful. Wonderful. Hey, I want to be respectful of the fact that B has to leave shortly. So I'm going to ask you if you have a closing thought you want to share in a second. And then I want everybody else who's in today to know that our next section is about a town hall. So you're going to get a chance for you to ask Yael some questions, and we have some other people that you can really ask questions of. So that's coming up next, is a town hall. If you're scratching your head and you really want to figure out a next step around this, this part of the call won't be recorded, but we're really excited to be able to be there and a resource for you to answer some questions. B, was there a last thought you wanted to share before we switch to the town hall section?
I want to thank you, Jessica, for inviting us. It's also been just fascinating to hear like the different, perspectives on how people are addressing this and their thinking and their work and their parenting and all the multiple roles. I guess I would say, as someone who, they do have the reassuring, I'd say, aspect to, like, as you get older, you get mellower. That's actually kind of true. You can choose to get mellower. And also, but it's the tension, to go back to what Yael is talking about, it doesn't end. And when the more conscious one becomes of like how you manage it and how you manage it together, if there is a together, the easier it is and the more gratifying it is that you've managed it. So there you go.
Thank you so much, B.
Thank you
Really
so
glad to
much.
have you here.